good since I have to turn that way anyway. Okay, please stand and cover yourself for the reading of our scripture today. We do this in honor of, it's a tradition, not a law, but Yeshua, the guy they call Jesus, he did it. His Talmudim, his disciples did it. We want to be as much like them as we can. Our verse today comes from Yeshayahu, that's Isaiah, chapter 57, verse 7. It says, Ma nuva al he harim, ragle mevaser mashmiya, shalom mevaser tov mashmiya, Yeshua omer le zion malach Elohayik. All right, you may be seated. Okay, so most Christians are familiar with Galatians chapter 1, verse 8, which says, But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than that which we have preached, let him be accursed. Most, if not all Christians would agree that the gospel they have received is in fact the same gospel that the apostles taught their followers. Christians are therefore conditioned by these beliefs to immediately reject anything they hear that is contradictory to their understanding of the English Bible. They see anyone who would dare question their beliefs as heretics, authors of confusion, and liars. They also believe that anyone who would listen to these heretics is deceived. Without declaring this to be true, now hear me carefully here, without declaring this to be true, let me ask an unthinkable question. What if the church has been deceived from its inception and did, in fact, teach a gospel that is different from that which the apostles taught? How would Christians who are already conditioned to reject anything in conflict with their personal beliefs ever actually hear it? 99.9% or more couldn't. Some may think this utter rejection of anything contradictory to their beliefs is good, if not necessary, safeguard against false doctrine. However, people who automatically reject anything new or foreign to their current knowledge are not actually seeking the truth. Frankly, people are not actually interested in the truth if they automatically reject that which is in conflict with their ideas and beliefs when they have no knowledge of these new to them ideas. In fact, if they are unwilling to research information they feel contradicts what they already believe, they will never know for sure if they actually know the truth. Unfortunately, most of the people who take the time to look things up simply find information that lines up with their preconceived beliefs and become all the more adamant that their beliefs are correct. This happens because in the West, everyone studies to prove that which they already believe. On a more terrifying note, if the church has been deceived from inception, remember, I'm not declaring this to be true, but on a more terrifying note, if the church has been deceived from inception, virtually all information that can be researched would be inaccurate. Again, without declaring this to be true, let me reword this unthinkable question. What would you do if you found out that the gospel the church teaches is not the gospel that was taught by the apostles? Would you reject it? What would be more important to you, sticking with what you've always known or following the truth, no matter what it is, no matter what it costs? Truth is, almost all of us would downplay that which turned out to be false and make a concerted effort to clean up the problem doctrines in an attempt to strengthen Christianity. It is not likely that we would reject Christianity outright because we would still believe it to be the truth in spite of the truth. We can't wrap our heads around something so crazy, can we? Now let me ask some questions and make some comments that are absolutely true, but they might seem pretty inflammatory. Not for the sake of making people mad. I'm not a shock jock. but to seek a fundamental truth about you, the listener. As I ask these questions and make these comments, ask yourself, do I accept these questions and comments and statements as true, or do I reject them right here, right now? If you reject these questions and comments, ask yourself, do I reject this because it feels wrong, or do I reject it based on my education in biblical customs, culture, language, and history? I am in no way attempting to put down anyone or attempting to put anyone in their place. I am in no way suggesting that my knowledge and or education is superior to yours. I don't know what your knowledge and or education is. I am simply asking you to pin down whether your belief is based on knowledge or on feeling. Additionally, may I suggest that we take the time to question the origin of our knowledge. As Dr. Roy Blizzard Jr. likes to say, question the answers. That is to say, question every answer given regarding the truth. If it could be that the answer is not based in truth. And finally, do you truly know that your source is legitimate? So here we go. What would you do if you found out that Kepa, it's the man they call Peter, was not the first pope, since there weren't any until the late 400s CE? That's more than 300 years after he died. What would you do if you found out that the cock that crowed when Kepa, Peter, denied the Lord was a young man announcing the time of prayer, not a male chicken? In the biblical period, the person making the announcement was called the cock, and the act of announcing was called crowing. This practice was so common that even the Romans used these terms. By the Dark Ages, these people were called the town crier. What would you do if you found out Jesus is not the name of the Lord? His name has always been Yeshua, which means he is salvation. When translators attempted to spell out his name in Greek, they ran into a couple issues. They could spell out the ye or ye sound, but there is no sh or sh sound in Greek. So it was shortened to an s sound. So it starts off being spelled Y-E-S instead of Y-E-S-H. The second issue is that his name ended in an A. But any name ending in an A or an A sound in Greek is feminine. So the Greeks changed the A sound at the end of his name to an S. So Yeshua became Yesua, Y-E-S-U-A. Then Jesus, Y-E-S-U-S. Is that starting to sound familiar? As the English alphabet changed, Y-E-S-U-S became J-E-S-U-S. Because when the J and the sound associated with it was first invented, roughly 600 years ago, the J made the Y-E or Y sound. It was still pronounced Jesus. Even though it was spelled with a J, it was still pronounced Jesus. But eventually, Jesus morphed to Jesus and then Jesus. Yeshayahu or Isaiah 43:11, and this is God speaking. He says, I am Yahweh, and except for me, there is no Moshiach. Does that sound familiar to some of you? Yeshua HaMashiach. Beside me, Yahweh, there is no Moshiach. Calling the Mashiach Yeshua is an idiomatic way of calling Yeshua or Jesus Yahweh. It's no different than calling Yeshua Yahweh or God in the flesh. What would you do if you found out that the common languages of the first century Judean world were Hebrew and Greek, not Aramaic and Latin? What would you do if you found out that the entire Christian Bible from cover to cover was written by Jewish rabbis. Some of you are saying, hey, Rob, you forgot about Luke. But to that I say, Luke was not a Gentile. Now, it could be that he had a Jewish mother and a Greek father, which would explain why a Jewish man had a Greek name. After all, Jewish women marrying Greek men and giving their boys Greek names was very common in this time period. And don't forget, women, not men, raised the children. And if the mother was Jewish, she raised her children in the only religion she knew, Judaism. In case you don't know, there are no circumstances in the first century CE where a Greek man would have been allowed to teach a Jew. None. Political correctness and equal rights did not exist, and being prejudiced at that time was not frowned upon. At this point, I would like to suggest that the smoking gun here is the actual name Luke. The Greek name Luke means light bearer, and thus makes it obvious to me that his actual name was Aharon, or as we know it today, Aaron, which is the Hebrew name that means light bearer, and was later changed by translators to Luke. What would you do if you found out that there is no such thing as an original Hebrew or Greek text? No such thing. Thus, no Bible on this planet has ever been translated from the original Hebrew and or Greek. Not one, even though most of them make this claim. All Greek texts have been tampered with, and most are nothing more than a translation of the Latin Vulgate, all or in no small part, as is claimed by some. The Vulgate was completed in the 390s CE. None of the Greek fragments currently known to exist predate the Vulgate. None of them. Unless, of course, we believe some obscure scholars who have come up with some very, shall we say, artistic ways to date a couple of the fragments. Almost to the time of the disciples. They still can't get it to the time, but they can almost get it there. You heard right. There is no Greek New Testament text from the time of the disciples who are credited with writing it. The earliest Greek New Testament fragment we have today was written 300 years after the last apostle died. Most, if not all, were written after the Latin Vulgate was completed. Additionally, none of the more than 8,000 Greek fragments are in agreement with each other, raising extreme disagreement, arguments, and doubts among most, if not all, Greek scholars concerning authenticity and even authority. Many doubt the legitimacy of all New Testament texts. Some Greek scholars believe that the New Testament letters were not written by the apostles at all, but were written by men in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries in opposition to the writings of the Jewish sages of the time. What would you do if you found out that the Masoretic text, from which all Christian Old Testaments have been translated, is all but identical to the Hebrew text of Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was written approximately 1,000 years before the Masoretic text was developed by the Masoretes? So, Hebrew texts written 1,000 years apart are virtually identical, while Greek texts written weeks, months, and years apart have almost nothing in common. Shouldn't that tell us something? What would you do if you found out that the idea for the need of a New Testament was not suggested until about 100 years after the last apostle died, and was rejected by religious leaders until the Gentiles took control? What would you do if you found out that the collection of letters that Christians now accept as the New Testament wasn't suggested until 367 CE? The New Testament as we know it, those letters, that combination of letters that are put together in the form that we now know as the New Testament, not even suggested until 367 CE. In Book 3 of Eusebius's church history, which is the accepted official history of the Catholic and thus Protestant Church, he said that the Catholic Fathers, now known as the Church Fathers, taught that Second Kepa, or Second Peter, should not be thought of as canonical. He also said that there was no reason to include the book of Revelation in the Catholic scriptures, since none of the Catholic fathers, now known as church fathers, none of them quoted it. He went on to say that some authorities have rejected the epistle to the Hebrews, pointing out that the Roman Church denied that it was the work of Shaul, or Paul. He further said no one had ever suggested to him that the book of Acts was genuine. Again, that's from Book 3 of Eusebius's church history, written sometime before his death in 339 CE. That's about 300 years after Yeshua, the man Christians call Jesus, 300 years after he died on the cross. What would you do if you found out that the Shabbat, that's what we call the Sabbath, is on Saturday? And according to a correct translation of Hebrews chapter 4, verse 8, no one is allowed to change it to any other day, not even Sunday. What would you do if you found out that no one in the biblical period was sprinkled as a child or dunked by another person? Since every Jew squatted down in the water with a person who witnessed that every part of the person, hair included, was completely submerged. The person who witnessed the immersion is now known as the baptizer, even though he never touched the baptizee. In fact, it is estimated that around 50 million people were put to death by the Catholic Church during the Dark Ages, just because they all wanted to be dunked. They wanted to dunk themselves the way their Lord and his disciples did. 50 million. What would you do if you found out that few Christians actually know what sin is, and worse yet, what sin is not? If you ask a room full of Christians to define sin, you'll receive a very long list of offenses, maybe even do's and don'ts. You'll also find much disagreement. Some feel that drinking is a sin, others don't. Some will believe that not attending church every Sunday morning is a sin, others won't. Some will think the question a moot point since we are all supposed to live under grace. You know, say the 8-second prayer and believe it, and it won't matter what you do for the rest of your life because the blood of Christ covers it all. The best explanation of what sin is and what sin is not is actually found in the Christian New Testament in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, which says, everyone who commits sin is also in rebellion of the Torah, because sin is Torah rebellion. Did you hear that? Everyone who commits sin is also in rebellion of the Torah. I know your English text says law, but that's what the law is, right? The Torah. They're in rebellion of the Torah because sin is Torah rebellion. Verse 5 tells us that Yeshua, or Jesus, never committed Torah rebellion. And here's what verse 6 says. Those who abide in him, speaking of Yeshua, Jesus, those who abide in him do not commit Torah rebellion. Those who abide in Torah rebellion have not seen him, neither know him. What would you do if you found out the church didn't start on the day of Shavuot, which is called Pentecost, of course, by Christians? This is impossible because, according to Acts chapter 2, there were no Gentiles present on the day of Shavuot, and because Catholicism didn't actually start until the 300 CE, and the Protestant or Christian church didn't spin off from Catholicism until the 1500s CE. In Eusebius's church history, he states the following. Now listen carefully. It's very, very important. This is in book 1. It's almost in the very beginning of the book. Both the antiquity and the divine character of Christian origins will be demonstrated to those who imagine them to be recent and outlandish. appearing yesterday for the first time. Do you hear it? He's admitting that in his lifetime, somewhere close to 339, somewhere just before that, somewhere in the 320s perhaps, somewhere around that time period, he's saying that Christianos is a brand new word. It's a brand new religion. It's a brand new movement, but he's going to find a way to prove that it's not new, that it's been around for a very long time. He also said, but although we certainly are a youthful people, you get it? That's code for though we're a new religion. And this undeniably new name of Christianos, this undeniably new name of Christianos has only lately, we're talking somewhere in the 300s, around 320 CE, has only lately become known among all nations. Nevertheless, in spite of all that, that's code for check your brain at the door and just believe what I'm about to say. Don't look behind the curtain. Nevertheless, our life and mode of conduct together with our religious principles have not been recently invented by us, but from almost the beginning of man, were built on the natural concepts of those whom God loved in the distant past, as I shall proceed to show. He went on to say that the religious beliefs and customs of this newly formed Catholic religious organization were in line with the customs, beliefs, and practices of the people in the Hebrew Bible before the law was given. He's only making the connection between Adam and Abraham. After Abraham, all bets are off. Which is code, of course, for the newly formed Catholic religion, did not follow Torah, but were connected to the Hebrew Bible simply because they accepted the Hebrew God as the creator of all that is. To cap off his insane argument as to why the newly formed Catholic religion should actually be thought of as an old religion, he said the following: all these who, speaking of everyone from Adam to Abraham, all these whose righteousness won them commendation, going back from Abraham himself to the first man. So he's going backwards, Abraham to Adam. So it's that time period he's talking about. They might be described as Christianos. They might be, in fact, if not in name, without departing far from the truth. I hope you catch what he just, I hope you caught that, without departing far from the truth. So, since his argument wasn't too far from the truth, in other words, since his argument's a lie, but not too far from the truth, we should just go ahead and accept what he's saying. One standout in the official church history is the complete absence of any mention of the church starting on the day of Shavuot, the day of Pentecost. He never even mentions it. It wasn't there because this doctrine didn't exist in the 300s CE. What would you do if you found out that the Lord didn't say, upon this rock I will build my church, but that in the late 1500s, translators were ordered by King James to change certain words? The Greek text actually says, upon this rock I will restore my congregation. Restore, not build, restore. Why would they say build instead of restore, Rob? That's two different things. Well, in Hebrew and Greek, the word for restore, or for restore or build or new, I mean, restore or new, it's the same word. Because think about grass. It comes up every year, it dies, it comes back. The next year, it dies, it comes back. So you can say it's new every year, or you could say it's renewed every year. Do you follow what I'm saying? Restore and build are the same word. He said, I will restore. How do we know that? Because he's talking about something that already existed, not something new. I will restore my congregation. What would you do if you found out that the Lord did not come for the Gentiles? In Levi, what we call Matthew, chapter 15, verse 24, the Lord himself said, I am not. I am not, N-O-T, not, underline that word, I am not sent, but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, which is the proper way to say Israel. I am not sent, but to the lost sheep of Israel. He's not sent, but to the lost Jews, the backslidden Jews. He didn't come here for anyone else. And he said it himself. Matthew chapter 15, verse 24. What would you do if you found out that an 8-second prayer cannot save anyone? Since Yaakov, you know him as James, James chapter 2, verse 14 tells us that faith cannot save us. He goes on to say that we must have faith, as it would be faithfulness if it was translated properly. But let's go with faith, since that's what your English Bible says. You cannot be saved by that. You must have faith and works. Yes, he said faith and works. It takes two things to be saved, not one. Maybe I should talk about contradictions in the New Testament doctrine here. Neither God nor the disciples of Yeshua, that's who we know as Jesus, neither God nor the disciples suffered from schizophrenia. God is not schizophrenic. He's not masochistic. He's not evil, right? And nor were the disciples of Yeshua. They were not schizophrenic. They were not masochistic. They were none of those things, right? It's important that we establish this thing here, because it is thus impossible for one verse to say we must live by God's law and another to say God's law passed away, that we don't live by God's law, because it's one contradicts the other and either makes God schizophrenic or it makes the Talmudim, the disciples, schizophrenic. This is not possible. It doesn't matter what the Bible means to you, because that's what happens. I start saying this is not possible. You cannot, because if I say we have to live by the law, generally what happens is 10 Christians jump up, get angry, immediately start chaining bits and pieces of 10 or 15 different scriptures together and say, see there, that proves you wrong, Rob. But there's a fundamental problem here, because I can chain together 10 or 15 pieces and bits and parts of 10 or 15 different verses and say, see, that proves me right. Do you see do you see a problem here? And so when I say, look, you can't do that in proper translational rules. There are rules to translating Greek and Hebrew text. There are rules. They have grammar rules just like we have grammar rules. And it's against grammar rules to do such things. You cannot mix concepts. That's one of the first things you have to learn, is you cannot mix concepts. If this one's talking about one concept, you cannot mix it into another concept. It's against the rules. And so as soon as I get them to understand that, the first thing they say is, that's not what it means to me. In the discussion, that's not what it means to me. But in the end, and this is very important for everyone who says things like that to think about, in the end, it doesn't matter. It makes no difference on this earth what it means to you. It only matters what it means to God. What would you do if you found out that the teaching that the Bible is infallible, inerrant, and inspired was not taught by the church or published in writing until 1978 in a document titled The Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy? 1978. What would you do if you found out that the Trinity, as we know it today, was invented by an idol-worshipping pagan by the name of Jerome, who added it to his Latin Vulgate in the late 300s CE, which was later translated into Greek and then English? All right, we're going to have to stop for just a second. Just let it run, I guess. You want to go sit over there? We can clip this, right? Okay. And let's just all wait. I'm going to back up and start at the top of that one. When she gets back, remind me to do that. I'll just like line it up. And kind of have a new way of doing things again. Trying to get around all these technical issues we keep having. We're doing this thing on Google now, and the video is just spectacular. You know, when we were doing it on the other one, the video looked really bad. But boy, this stuff looks really good.
On Google?
Yeah. And then you don't have to worry about after you've done it, you edit it, and then you upload it to Google. You know, this is uploading as we're going. And somehow you can edit it after the fact, like we're going to cut this little piece out, you know, and then, but you don't have to re-upload and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's her problem, not mine. That's what I was thinking. That's pretty awesome that you don't have to do that, but I guess you do. All right, here we go. What would you do if you found out that the Trinity, as we know it today, was invented by an idol-worshipping pagan by the name of Jerome, who added it to his Latin Vulgate in the late 300s CE, which was later translated into Greek and then English? The origin of the Trinity doctrine actually comes from the teachings of Greek philosophers as early as the 1st century CE, but predominantly in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, who are, for the most part, now known as Gnostics. Jerome's conversion of this idea into the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost was the obvious next step. What would you do if you found out that 2 Timothy 3:16 does not say all Scripture is given by inspiration of God? It doesn't say that. A translator wrote those words. The Greek text actually says the entire Tanakh, the Graphe, the writings, the Old Testament, if you will, is the Spirit of God. The book the Christians call the Old Testament and say passed away and is invalid at this point is in fact what this man was calling the Spirit of God. It used to be just the Torah was called the Spirit of God. He is expanding it. So he says the entire Tanakh, the entire Graphe, the entire writings is or are the Spirit of God. And what does the Old Testament do? Well, it brings growth through doctrine, through reprimand, through correction, because it is instruction in righteousness. There can be little doubt that this statement was made because at the time the Torah was called the Spirit of God, the Torah, just the first 5 books. And the writer felt that the same could be said about the entire Hebrew Bible. That's it in a nutshell. What would you do if you found out that there is only one God and he has never had a son? Jesus was not the product of Mary and God. He was not half man and half God. That teaching comes from Greek mythology. Yeshua, the guy we call Jesus, he was Emmanuel. You know, Emmanuel to say it right. That means God with us. He was not Bar Emmanuel. He was not the Son of God with us. Remember, Trinitarian doctrine, as we know it today, didn't exist in the biblical period. Jesus was called the Son of God because in his time, men were called the son of their teacher. Not so much to honor the teacher, which was, kind of part of it, but really that's not what it was about. But it was because the student not only taught exactly what the teacher taught him, but because the student acted exactly like his teacher. Thus, since Jesus was a human who did exactly what God does, give sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, a voice to the mute, or mute, I think it is. I always get those confused. He walked on water, raised the dead after 4 days, etc. He was the Son of God, which is, of course, idiomatically said of a manifestation of God in human flesh. Had nothing to do with God having a child. What would you do if you found out that there is no such thing as a new and or old covenant, and there is no such thing as a new and or old testament? We know this because the Hebrew and Greek texts of Yirmiyahu, that's Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, as well as Hebrews 8:8, 8:13, and 12:24, all say new sacrifice, not new covenant. This knowledge should make us realize that the Old Testament did not pass away and was not replaced with a new one, since there is no such thing. Additionally, the terms end of days, end of the age, the day of judgment, the day of vengeance, these were all used of the time when God would restore Israel to right standing. Remember, he came for Israel. He didn't come for anyone else. But it's of the time when God would restore them to right standing, the day when God would restore his covenant with his people. Through Haggai, as you probably know it, chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, God tells us that the latter glory of his house, which is the temple, would be greater than the former. It is not clear to me if any of the ancient Jews ever truly understood biblical prophecy beyond the prophets themselves, and I'm not terribly sure the prophets understood it. What is clear is that after the period of Hellenization, understanding of prophecy and of the Hebrew Bible became far more literal in nature. This may well be the reason behind Kepha, or Peter's teaching in 2 Peter 3:16, that those who were amethysts, the Greek word he used was amethyst, which means those who are without rabbinic training, he said they translated the Bible, the entire Hebrew Bible, which you would call the Old Testament, and all of Shaul's or Paul's letters to their own destruction. And destruction was used idiomatically by the Jews of separation from God. So in other words, if you weren't trained by the rabbis, everything that was in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and everything that Shaul or Paul wrote, everything you thought about it would separate you from the truth. It would separate you ultimately from God. Everything. And I'm not saying this. Kepha, Peter said that. It kind of makes you understand why the church fathers didn't want 2 Peter in the canon. Those who were rabbinically trained most likely would have known that the first temple was any and all tabernacles and temples built and rebuilt by man. That is to say, they were all physical buildings, while the second temple would be built by God, which would make it spiritual. In other words, the second temple is the human body. In short, the second temple exists in our hearts. As Hellenization or Hellenism slipped into the Jewish world, Yeshayahu or Isaiah 54:11 and 12 began to take on a very literal meaning. Here's my translation of the Hebrew. O afflicted one, storm-tossed and without comfort, I am about to set your stones with fair colors and lay your foundations with sapphires. I will make your pinnacles of rubies, your gates of jewels, and all your wall of precious stones. The Hellenized Jews of the first century struggled with this passage. One, they had trouble believing that God would use a half-Jew, Gentile-friendly man to build the second temple, speaking of Herod. Two, they didn't see the sapphires, rubies, and other precious stones in the temple. You can see why they would believe that that was literal, because in the temple, the entire walls were covered with gold, real gold. Everything was made of gold. So why would they not believe that there would be sapphires and rubies everywhere else? You know what I mean? I mean, that's why it would be so easy to take that so literal. They didn't see it, so they're like, I don't know if this is the second temple. From the time of the Maccabees, the Jews began to tie the idea of the ingathering of the lost tribes to the building of God's second temple. This played a huge role in the reason why Jewish leadership rejected Jesus as Mashiach, as the Messiah, even though all the signs were clearly there. In fact, the destruction of the temple in 70 CE is still the main reason why Yeshua is rejected as Mashiach to this very day by the Jews. When the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, many Jews became convinced that the Mashiach had not come, because prophecy said that the second temple would stand forever. Consequently, Many, if not most, of the Jews forsook Yeshua, they forsook Jesus, and turned to the future for the coming of Mashiach. The letter of Revelations was actually written before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. However, a mistranslation of an obscure text dating Yohanan or John the Revelator's letter would eventually lead the Catholics and ultimately the church down the same road, everyone looking to the future for the end of days, instead of realizing they had already come, just as Yeshua said. Remember, the end of days was not the end of the world as we know it. It was the end of the age when the Jews were separated from their covenant with God. What would you do if you found out that the law did not pass away, nor was it replaced by grace? In the biblical period, those who lived according to the Torah were said to live by grace, while those who did not live by the Torah were said to live under the bondage of the law, under the curse of the law, under the punishment of the law. All three are the same thing. Think about it. If every word that proceeds from the mouth of God is perfect and pure, how can anyone teach that living according to the Torah is legalism or that it passed away? The words in the Torah, the law of God, came directly from the mouth of God. Therefore, to call obedience to the Torah legalism is to accuse God of being the author of legalism. The biblical text never said that we live by faith in opposition to the law of the Torah. Pagan kings and translators did that. What would you do if you found out that changing the names of almost every person and place in the Bible, changing every occurrence of the Hebrew and Greek words that mean congregation to church, changing almost every occurrence of synagogue to assembly, adding and taking away words and sentences and sometimes paragraphs, replacing the names of female apostles and female rabbis with men's names, and forsaking the law of Torah with the man-made doctrine of rebellion, which is called grace, is known as replacement theology. Replacement theology is at the very heart of Antichrist. Anything and everything but that which God gave us. But think of it this way. Calling the Mashiach, that is to say, calling God in the flesh, Yeshua, was so important to God that he sent a messenger, an angel, if you will, to Joseph and Miriam, that's Joseph and Mary, all the way from heaven to make sure his wishes were carried out. This is how important it was. Changing the names of every person and place in the Bible was not done because we pronounce these names differently in our language. None of these names existed in any other language. Linguistically speaking, if we don't have an equivalent name, we simply transliterate the name so that we can pronounce it as closely as possible. We just spell it out with our alphabet in a way that helps people pronounce it the way it was pronounced in its original language. That's transliteration. Knowing that there were absolutely no equivalent Greek or English names, we can say Robert in English, and in Spanish, they say Roberto. So they had some equivalent, right? But truly, Roberto is probably a transliteration of Robert. Or perhaps Robert is a transliteration of Roberto. They probably didn't actually have names in this one language that was the equivalent of the name in another. It's probably transliteration. But if it were, those two would be, that would be a pretty good explanation if it's not transliteration. Anyway, truth is, the reason why almost all names of people and places were changed in our Bibles was in fact to make our translations a lot less Jewish. Though these questions and comments may seem inflammatory and outlandish, they are nonetheless true. The name of this message today is By Any Other Gospel. Now we'll get into the message. It'll be a little short now. Let's start with the church's definition of the gospel. Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, walked on water, healed the sick, gave sight to the blind, made the lame to walk, the deaf to hear, made the dumb to speak, cast out devils, died on a cross, and rose from the grave to save us all from our Torah rebellion, from our sins, if we just believe. If we just believe. Some, if not most, would add to that, well, you must go to church, you must pay your tithes and be good people. Additionally, we must believe that the church started on the day of Pentecost. And as you know, that teaching wasn't even in the official church history. We must believe that the law is legalism and bondage, and that Jesus came to do away with the law and Judaism and replace it with grace in the church. Now let's look at what the Bible calls the gospel. The Hebrew text of Yeshayahu, Isaiah 52:7, starts out with the word ma. Ma means what or how. It's interrogatory, it's an interrogation, it's question. It's not literally so much that the word means what or how, it's that's kind of their question mark in Hebrew, if you will. It's followed with navu, which is beautiful. It's from the root that means to sit, to dwell, serenity, calm, stillness, to respire, to rest. So how does that make sense? Where do they get beautiful? Well, it's in a form called PL in Hebrew grammar. And that doesn't really mean a lot, but in PL it's of being suitable, becoming agreeable, something that is fitting. They say beautiful. It's okay. It's not necessarily wrong. I wouldn't go there myself. I would put the word fitting in place of navu for English. That's followed by all, the Hebrew word all, which means honor upon. Then it says heharim, that's the mountains. Ragle, the feet, that's just feet in plural. Mevaser, that says brings good tidings. It's from the root that is to be joyful, cheerful, especially in receiving glad tidings. To gladden with good tidings. You see why they call it the good news? The primary sense appears to be that of beauty, whence fair, beautiful. Sense of face is made more beautiful by joy and cheerfulness. It lightens, it brightens, if you will. That's where they get the idea. It's to make anyone cheerful with glad tidings or with good news, to bear good news, to announce good news to anyone. It is more rarely used of any messenger and even of unpleasant news. It's in PL, again, which is to make anyone cheerful with glad tidings, to bear glad tidings, to announce glad tidings to anyone. But it is also used of bringing bad news. In short, it is to bring news, good or bad. So to translate it good news is a little out there. You should say to bring news, not to bring good news, but just news, because the news can be good or it can be bad. You follow? Then that's followed with mashmiah, which from the root it's to hear with the ears, to understand with the whole heart and mind, and to act upon what you've heard. Did anybody guess what the word is? Shema. This word is in hefil, so it's to cause someone to hear. It's like when you have children, particularly little boys, and you tell them go wash your hands while they're playing and their mouth is going. That doesn't really work, does it? You have to cause them to hear. So what do parents do? They grab the little boy, turn the face to their face, and say, go wash your hands. They cause them to hear, and the boy will go wash his hands. That's at least my experience with child rearing. All right, so that's followed by the word shalom, peace. That's all we really need is peace. Then ma'vaser, which is that's to bring the good news, but we really realize that's to bring news. So we've already had that word. And then that's also in PL, of course. But then this one, this time, is followed with tov. Well, that is good. So first we're going to bring news. Now we're going to bring good news. And good, tov in Hebrew is not just good, it's perfect. God said, he looked at the world and all that he had created and all that he had done. Remember, it always says, and God said it's good. God was literally saying it is perfect. So goodness is perfection. This is followed by mashmiah. Now, we've already had this. It's from the shama, to hear with the ears, understand with the whole heart and mind, and to act upon what you've heard. Then it's Yeshua. Now, this is not a name. This is not a noun. How do I know? Because the last letter in this word is in Hebrew called Hey. We would write an H in its place. So if you look at the word Yeshua and it has an H on the end, it's a verb. If it doesn't have the H, it's a noun. It's that simple. All right, so in this case, instead of it being the person we call Yeshua, this is salvation. That's why Yeshua means he is salvation, or he will bring salvation. You could say it that way. It's mostly he is salvation. But this is salvation. It's not the proper name of the Messiah. It's a verb. It's salvation. Remember, that's that word from Yashah, the ample, broad, spacious, opulence, and all that stuff, because it's the opposite of being imprisoned. In their time period, the prison was a hole in the ground. They dropped you in there. They put a rock over the top, and you were in complete darkness, cramped down in this thing. And you don't want to move around much, because the more you move, the further you dropped into the hole, and the more cramped it became, and the harder it would be to breathe. So when they pull you out of prison, this is the opposite of being in prison. This is freedom. Okay, so that's salvation in a nutshell. Wow, nutshell that's in the nutshell. Okay, Omer is our next word. That's a saying or a declaration. Let Zion, you've heard it as Zion. Malach, that's reigns. Elohayik, our God. Here's my translation. How fitting upon the mountains are the feet which bring news, causing peace to be heard, which bring good news, causing salvation to be heard, saying to Zion, here's the most important part, saying to Zion, what was the last thing it said? Your God reigns. Our God reigns. This is so important. How fitting upon the mountains are the feet which bring news, causing peace to be heard. The news causes peace to be heard, which bring good news, causing salvation to be heard, saying, your God reigns, or our God reigns. You say it either way, it won't make any difference. Saying to Zion, not to the observant Catholic, not to the observant Jehovah's Witnesses, not to the observant Mormons. I knew I was going to say that. Not to the, got my emphasis on the wrong syllable. Not to the observant Mormons, not to the observant Seventh-day Adventists, not to the observant Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, or any other of the 38,000 church denominations in existence today and counting, saying to Zion, saying to the Jews, your God reigns. Do you know what the good news is? Our God reigns. In short, the gospel is news that causes peace and salvation to be heard. But what is the peace and the salvation spoken of in Yeshayahu and Isaiah? It is the announcement that the God of Zion, the God of the Jews, their God reigns. It's why their Moshiach came for them. Aren't you glad that's us? The God of us Jews, of we Jews, is on the throne. But it's so much more than that to the Jews, to the Yehudim. Hosea, chapter 4, verse 15, tells us that the Jews can no longer say, Yahweh lives. So what we've done is I've just jumped back to the place where God is about to give Yisrael her bill of divorcement. Yeah, that's what's happening here. And it starts off, well, I'm starting off with 4:15, which says the Jews can no longer say God lives. It is taken by some that God was saying, you, the Jews, are dead to me. However, the truth is that God was saying, I am dead to you. That's why you can't say Yahweh lives, because Yahweh is dead to you. That's a big difference, isn't it? Hosea 1:9 says, and he, speaking of Yahweh, said, call his name Lo Ami. Call his name Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I do not exist to you. I do not exist to you. That's why they're not his people. Lo Ami, meaning lo, not, Ami, my people. Hosea 2:2 says, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. And turn away her prostitution from her presence, and her adultery from between her breasts. That's idiomatic, I hope you understand. Her idol worship is her prostitution, and her lack of obedience to the Torah is her adultery. But God gave the Jews hope, something to look forward to. Hosea 2:14 says, therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her to the wilderness, and I will speak to her heart. 2:19 says, and I will betroth her to me forever. And I will betroth her to me in righteousness and in judgment and in kindness and in mercy. 2:20 says, and betroth her to me in faithfulness. See, this was the problem all along. And she will know Yahweh. 2:23 says, and I will sow her to me in the earth, and I will be merciful. That means there'll be many of them. I'll sow her to me in the earth. There'll be lots of, over the time, there'll be lots of them who know Yahweh. That's what sow her to me in the earth means. And I will be merciful to her. Who was not merciful? The Jews at the time of their divorcement were not merciful people. And I will say to those who are not my people, what did he just say? Tell her I am calling low on me because I am not their God. They're not my people, right? So he's talking to the Jews. I will say to you who are not my people, you are my people. And they will say, then the way you got to see this in Hebrew, they're not just saying you are my God. It's they're reaching out their hand and wrapping them around him and saying, you are my God. And they will say, our God reigns. That's the gospel. The gospel of Mashiach has never been a new gospel. It did not replace the gospel of Zion. It was the message to the Jews that the sacrifice of Mashiach had brought peace to Zion. The gospel of peace is reconciliation of the covenant between God and the house of Israel. That is to say, it is the gift of salvation. It's simple. The Yehudim, the Jews, broke their covenant with God and were given a document of divorce. They had been reduced to just another Gentile nation because of their Torah rebellion. The only difference between this Gentile nation and all the others is that the God of Zion promised that the day would come in which he would reconcile his people, which are the house of Israel, to himself. You see why that was so important when Yeshua said, I am not come, but for the house of Israel? The day would come when they could once again say, Yahweh lives. They could say, our God reigns. In short, the gospel of Mashiach was brought to the Yehudi, or Jewish people, via the Talmudim, the disciples of Yeshua. The message was clear. God had slain the new sacrifice. The new sacrifice, Yeshua, was the new sacrifice. And all the Yehudi, all the Jewish people had to do was wash their clothes and their body. In other words, get baptized just like they did at Sinai all those years ago, and then accept the authority of Torah over their lives. That is to say, live according to the Torah, and they could now enter into a face-to-face relationship with God, just like the relationship he had with Moshe. Just like it. Can you imagine? Face-to-face, behind the veil. The Jews also knew that when God restored his people, not only would their Torah rebellion, their sin be covered if they were faithful to keep their covenant, but the Torah rebellion, the sin of all Gentiles, could be covered if they would show their belief in Mashiach and become Torah observant like the Jews. No one in the biblical period converted to Christianity. This is not possible because it did not exist during this time. The Apostle Shaul, the Apostle Paul, did not go around setting up churches. Again, the church did not exist during this period. It didn't exist during his lifetime. Shaul set up synagogues. His entire ministry was to bring the gospel, the good news that God had reconciled his covenant with the Jews. It was his job to bring that to the Gentiles. What did it look like? What did it mean? It meant that Shaul's mission in life was to convert Gentiles to Judaism. It wasn't until the mid-300s CE that Gentiles began to piece together an utterly made-up version of their history, as we saw earlier with Eusebius' church history. The religious organization known as Catholicism was intentionally formed as a replacement to Judaism. The Jews lift holy hands in prayer with their heads and their palms turned toward the heavens. So the Catholics prayed with their heads down and their hands together. The Jews blessed God after they ate, as mandated by Devarim. You know it as Deuteronomy 8:10. So the Catholics prayed before their meals. And they changed the words of the Jews, which were bless you, O Lord, to bless us, O Lord. The Jews worship God on Saturday, so the Catholics worship Jesus on the day of sun worship, Sunday. The Jews celebrated all of God's holidays and none of the pagan holidays, so the Catholics celebrated all the pagan holidays and none of God's. In short, Catholicism did not come from the Bible. It was a man-made religion with the express intention of pulling together every religion of the world except Judaism. It was formed from a complete rejection of all things Jewish, and therefore a complete rejection of all things biblical. The newly formed Catholic religion needed a Bible, so they stole the Jewish Bible, as well as the letters written by the apostles. And then they translated them into Latin, because few people, the elite and the wealthy, only those people could speak it, that could read it, could understand it. They added things to it and took things from it, and intentionally perverted the text to line up with a religious reality that could be widely accepted among pagan religions of the time. The Church is a spin-off of Catholicism and has done nothing of consequence to correct any of these doctrines. Most people, at the point they break down and ask God to come into their hearts, are sincere and want to love Him with all their heart, soul, and strength. However, from the moment of conversion on, the Church unwittingly leads their converts down the road of paganism. They have no idea that the gospel they now follow is not the gospel taught by the apostles of the biblical period. Eventually, these people who meant it when they told God He could have their whole hearts reject the rule of God's Torah entirely, not knowing that the idea of living by grace in opposition to obedience to the Torah was not completely accepted by the church until the 1900s. Eventually, these people who swore their love to God become violently angry at times at any suggestion that what they know about their religion is not based on the truth, but rather lies and emotion. When I suggest that there is nothing legitimate about the church except for the conversion experience, most Christians quickly write me off as lost in legalism and bondage. They take 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 7 completely out of context and say that I am ever learning but unable to come to the knowledge of the truth. They accuse me of being an arrogant know-it-all, heretic bent on Judaizing God's children. The church was led astray by revisionist history, pagan culture, and now a complete dismissal of God's authority, a dismissal of His Torah. The church has been without the biblical history, customs, culture, and language from its inception. Most of what I have taught over the years is accurate because I'm a very disciplined translator. My methodology is very strict. However, I began my walk into the Hebraic world still believing that it would reconcile with the church. Thus, I used to teach things like it didn't matter what day we celebrated our Shabbat, only that we in fact celebrated it. I felt this way because myself and other people whom I loved didn't feel right about having service on Saturday. It was really weird at first. Not to mention that people whom I loved and felt were super spiritual had to work on Saturday. So surely God made exceptions to His rules for them. Otherwise, God would be all legalistic and full of bondage, right? Then I translated the Greek text of Hebrews chapter 4, verse 8 as follows. For if Yeshua would have given them a Shabbat, a Sabbath, would He not have spoken concerning another day among us? The subject of the chapter is the Shabbat, the Sabbath. The word Shabbat was then conveniently and strategically changed to the word rest, which of course is the meaning of Shabbat. Shabbat means rest. So if Yeshua was all right with the Shabbat, or the day of rest, or the rest day, whatever you want to call it, being changed to Sunday, why then didn't He ever mention it to even one of His Talmudim, of His disciples? That's the question being asked. That's the question that Aharon, Aaron, is asking his readers here in the letter to the Hebrews. It was at this point that I realized that God at no time has ever changed any of His rules or customs, and He has at no time ever made exceptions to His rules or His customs. If we live our lives in a manner that is designed to fit God into our busy schedules, if we only celebrate Shabbat when it is convenient for us, of course, or when we feel like it, God is not our king. He is instead reduced to nothing more than a golden cow that we've created to walk before us, in other words, to serve us. It wasn't until I tried to write a brief history of the church that I finally realized that there was no such thing as a first century church. The historical evidence simply doesn't support it. May I remind you that the official church history admits at least 3 times that the Catholic, thus Christian religion, was new in the mid 300s. The English word church and Christian were not invented until the advent of the English language in the 11 and 1200s CE. We're talking 11 and 1200s after Yeshua ascended back to heaven. Then you create a language that has the word church and Christian. Put plainly, there were no churches in the first century, and believers were not called Christians at Antioch. It's not possible. Events spoken of in the New Testament letters occurred during the first century CE, and Eusebius clearly told us that the word Christianos, he didn't say Christian, he said Christianos, was being used for the first time in church history. And he said this in the mid 300s, somewhere around 320s. I shouldn't say mid; it's early. He said that in somewhere around 320s. That's when he's saying it's being used for the very first time. Yet your text, which was supposedly written in the first century, uses those words. That's not possible, is it? All right. There was only the synagogue, which was changed to assembly, the congregation, which was changed to church, and the Mashiachite, which were changed to Christians eventually. They were first called Christianos and then eventually changed to Christian, 1,200 years after the fact. So if you're still listening to the sound of my voice, then you've heard the truth, and it is not easy. You are now faced with the question, what will I do with this? Will you come up with reasons why you should be able to continue on your current path, or will you accept that you've been deceived by a cursed gospel? It is my hope that you will search out all this information. I hope that you will not study to prove that which you already believe, but that you will be trained by a legitimate Hebrew-speaking rabbi. Why? Because 2 Peter 3:16, remember, it tells us that those who are amethysts, those who are not trained by the rabbis, translate all of the Tanakh, what we call the Old Testament, and pretty much everything that's in the New Testament, to their own destruction, to their separation from God. At least that's what the Greek text says. The ball is in your court. Will you follow the truth, no matter what it is, no matter what it costs, or will you reject it as heresy? In the end, your decision will have little, if any, effect on me. But you will have to stand before God and give account for your decision. So make it a good one. I've often been asked, where do I go from here? What do I do now? And to that, all I can say, well, you could buy you a ticket and fly over to Israel and go to school at the Hebrew University. And I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek, but on the other hand, it would be very good. It really would be a good thing if you could do that. You could go there. There are plenty of people out there that teach what I teach. But the only people that I know of that are doing it consistently and doing it on the Shabbat is myself. There's probably other people out there. I just don't know who they are. Hopefully, with this going out on Google, other people will be able to point those out to us, and we'll add them to our links on our website. But until then, what you could do is join us every Shabbat, every Saturday on Google. All right. Hit the button.